I'm just going to talk to you briefly. My presentation is pretty short. We're just going to talk about lab notebooks. Traditionally, I would give this talk in a room with students, and you would have lab notebooks in front of you, and we would start using them at the end. I still kept those slides in here, so if you have a lab notebook, you can follow those instructions. Otherwise, you're going to want to follow them, very quickly after this presentation. Okay, so what is a lab notebook? It's a complete record, okay? So it's procedures, data, thoughts, questions. You document why experiments were initiated, how they were performed, what you found out, all of the data you collected from any tests. You put clues in there, you troubleshoot problems, you think about the big picture, you consider additional add-on experiments, right? So everything, it's a document that covers your whole experience while you're inside that lab. Additional reasons that scientists and engineers keep lab notebooks is, one, it can be used as a legal document. So if you're trying to secure a patent or a defense against accusations of fraud or a lawsuit, you can actually use a lab notebook as a legal document. How will you use a lab notebook? So well, you might not know this, but as Greg mentioned, all of the work you do is cumulative. No one is ever going to tell you information you don't need. This is all like building block information. And so you want to put all of the information, or at least references to the information and all of the details, all of the work that you actually complete into this notebook so that you have a single space that you can reference back to. You're going to use this notebook when you're ready to write your first reports and do your presentations, and then later in the next semester when you're writing the more complicated design and documents and flight readiness reviews, you're going to really want access to this notebook. Okay, you don't want to have to walk back all the research you did, all the experiments you did, who wrote what piece of information down. You want everything all in one space. Normally, so the second half of this slide, normally we would be doing regular reviews of your lab notebooks to see, how you were doing. That's, going to be less likely. So I don't know how the instructors want to run it. Maybe dedicate 10 minutes every couple of weeks to just kind of talk about the lab notebooks and ask students to kind of actively in front of you, talk about what's in their notebooks and do a review. Okay, so you want to prepare your lab notebook for use. Okay, this is not just a typical write down in any book in any place. You want to have a format that makes sense to you that you can reference back to. And so on the cover and the inside cover of your notebook, you want to put the full contact information, right? Who you are, the context, which is LaACES at whatever university or college you're at, and then the beginning date of the notebook. When you fill that notebook, you're going to add in the end date. More than likely, you are not going to fill a lab book for this program, but if you become a scientist or an engineer, you're going to have dozens of lab books, and they're going to span more than one notebook for a project, okay? And so you want to be able to track that. You're going to take the first 3 pages, front and back pages, so 6 pages, and you're going to call that your table of contents pages. You're going to number that TOC 1 through TOC 6. Then you're going to number the pages, just regular numbers, number 1 through the rest of the book. Then you want to establish some sort of format for your entries that you can refer back into your table of contents. So perhaps it's the lecture name or the major activity that you're working on. So, skeeter stat, calibration, and then you want a start time. And then at the end of your entry, so when you're finished entering everything you need to do for that night, you're about to leave, the last thing you would do is exit that entry by giving it an end time. Okay, so this is gonna help you differentiate. So if you come back the next day and you're doing more work, you're gonna start a new entry. So what goes into your lab notebook? Everything, right? So notes on the lectures. Now you don't want to write down every single thing that your instructor tells you during a lecture, because you have access to these slides. They're on the website. You can always refer back. But there are some things that you don't want to, you're going to want regular, easy access to. And so you don't want to have to go back to the slides every single time you have this question about whether it's an equation or a process or, something, language that you should be using. You want to put that in your lab book. But you could put some references back to lectures also, right? So where did I learn about this particular software that we're supposed to use for the Skeeter set? Oh, that was in lecture 4.03. Let me just write that in my lab book so when I need to find it, I can reference back. You want to put group activities in there, right? So if you have an instruction sheet, you can tape that in, and any of the work that you did, you want to record the actual process that you followed and the results that you got, successes, failures, all of it. And then any independent research project development that you do on your own. When you move into the next semester and you're thinking about the actual science project that you might want to add on to your payload, you can be, you might do some research, you might read some articles, you might talk to a scientist on campus about a possible project. You should put your notes in here. This should also be a place where you can explore those ideas. Putting attachments into your lab book. I already mentioned in passing the assignment sheet. You could tape those in, but there's lots of things that you could tape into your notebook, and you just think about it as an attachment. So taking a picture of your procedure, your lab setup if you're about to do a test, any graphs, any data that you plot, the notes or conversations about the project that happen outside the lab, right? Maybe you email your instructor and ask some questions. Maybe your team is having a conversation and you come up with some really good questions. You could just print that out and paste it in. Bibliographic information for resources. This is really important when you're doing maybe your science background and you have a bunch of external literature that you're using. You want to be able to find that again and make sure that you cite it properly. And I tell you, it might feel like, oh, it was so easy for me to find that article, but then when you're going back to find it, to document it in one of your formal design documents, you can't find it. So you want to have full bibliographic information available. Okay, so how often should you be using your lab book, and how should you be using your lab book? So daily, take that with a grain of salt. I don't mean 7 days a week, but every time you're working in the lab or working on this project, you want to be writing stuff down in the lab notebook, right? Even when you make a mistake, I would say maybe even especially when you make a mistake, because this will help you learn in the future. And also, if you share this lab notebook with a novice, they can learn from your mistakes. On a weekly basis, I would recommend that you do a detailed review of what's in your notebook. So you can see if there are any errors, if maybe your language isn't so precise, maybe you didn't understand something at first and you understand it better now and you can fix it. Maybe your handwriting is not as legible as you thought it was and you want to make another entry to clarify that. It'll be much easier when the information is still fresh in your head. And then I would recommend about once a month, you just look back at everything, right? So you do a full-on review. And again, this will help you clarify any issues, or maybe you understand something better than you did before, and you could even reference, right? You could make references inside the lab notebook. You could put, an asterisk in the margin and say, see, on page 10, see page 30 for, a better representation of this info. Here are some tips for keeping your lab notebook. So never ever remove a page. If you remember in the beginning, I mentioned that these lab notebooks for professionals can be used as an actual legal document. Well, you pretty much mar the integrity of that document if you pull a page out, right? So you need to keep all the pages in. Fill consecutive pages, cross out unused parts of pages. So let's say you only get halfway through a page and then you're really moving on to something completely different, or you need to, paste a full page document in, so you're not going to use that space. Don't just leave it that blank. Put like an X through it as this is not used. Don't omit any results. You know, if you follow a particular procedure and you get a weird result and then you tweak it a little bit and you get the result you expected, you want to document both of those and make it clear what that tweak was. When you're working in the notebook, don't cram too much content into a page. Leave some space between the lines, in the margins, because you're going to want to make notes. When you do make notes later on, you want to make sure that you initial and date them so it's clear when those notes were added. Cross mistakes out lightly. Again, if you cross things out and they're completely illegible, this can mess with the integrity, but also you might actually be able to learn something from a mistake, so you want to be able to see it. Write legibly. Don't use felt tip pens. Don't use pens, you know, that can kind of bleed through to the other pages and make it difficult to read other information. But you do need to use pen and not pencil, right? It has to be something that is pretty permanent. Put a full date, you know, international. We don't all put our day, month, year in the same order, so you want to make sure that you spell everything out. And you want to date and timestamp all of your entries at the beginning and at the end. This slide is pretty irrelevant for this semester. At LSU, we required students to keep their lab notebooks in the lab at all times. So you couldn't leave with your lab notebook. It had to stay there. That's really useful because, one, you're never going to forget it. You're not going to lose it. And any number of people on your team can look at your lab notebook if they need it. If you worked on a particular test, you were in there the night before, your teammate comes in the next day to kind of pick up where you left off. They're not going to write in your lab book. They have their own, but they can review your lab book to see what happened. Then here is a checklist, right? So this is a checklist. This is good for instructors when they're reviewing lab notebooks. This is also good if you want to look at each other's lab books, or even if you're just doing a general review of your own lab book. So use a black or a blue ballpoint pen. Use other color pens and highlighters within reason. So what does that mean? That means don't make this document super colorful so that it's just, you know, it's colorful, but it doesn't really mean anything. But what you could do, maybe every time you have a new hypothesis, you are highlighting it in blue. Maybe every time you have a failure, you're using a red pen with an asterisk. And that would just help you if you wanted to go back through your document, your book quickly, you could find things like that. Make sure your handwriting is legible. Sometimes, like, our own handwriting is hard to read later. When we're reading it, when we're looking at it at the moment, the information is fresh, we know what we were talking about, and we can read it clearly. But 6 months down the road, we look back and it's like, what was I writing there? So, you know, take your time, rewrite things if you need to. Make sure you have content areas clearly identified, right? So you have these entry names, but if you do a specific test or trial, if you get specific results, make sure that you're doing some clear headings again so it's easy to find that information. Write in the first person. This is an active book that's documenting your activity, right? So I set the water temperature at such a degree. I tested 15 different temperatures. You know, you want to be active in first person. Use complete sentences with details, active verbs, and precise descriptions. Consider if someone with your same level of experience and content knowledge picks up your notebook, could they reproduce the experiments that you were doing? Okay, so can it be followed by another scientist? And then, are you thinking in the notebook? Do we see active questions and troubleshooting? And then, is the notebook stored safely and properly when not in use? This would be if we were keeping them in the lab, but I don't know how you would answer this question in a remote setting. Okay, this is content. So the previous one was format, this is content. So all the things that you should be seeing in a notebook: plans, ideas, realities, right? So you plan to do one thing. For example, this past year with COVID-19 impacted us in the middle of the spring semester, we planned to have a thermal vac test in April and to travel to CSBF in May. That did not happen. But we did test the payloads. We figured out a way to collect the payloads and have a flight later in the summer. That should be documented if something like that happens, if there's a deviation in plan. Observations, illustrations, links to other content should be showing up. Oh, this is in such and such a lecture, or this is a research document. Emails from other members of your team, summaries of papers you've read, hints and tips you might have gotten. Perhaps you talk to a faculty member on your campus about a specific research project that you might apply to this payload. You want to write all that kind of stuff down. Okay, so this is the moment where if we were in a room together, we would sit down and we would start numbering everything, and we're not able to do that. But the next step after you set up your lab book is to start using it regularly, right? So I would suggest that before every session, maybe for 15 minutes, come in, look at what you wrote the previous week, get your lab book set up for the day with an entry and a date, and be ready to start writing. I would ask someone now in your group who would be willing to look at your lab book and also the other documents you have to produce for this course. It's always helpful to have somebody else's eyes on stuff. We are much less likely to find something that's missing, especially in our own work, because we know we did this step, we know what happened, and so we can fill in that information when we're looking at our actual product that we've produced. But if someone else is looking at it, they're going to automatically notice, like, well, what happened when you did that test? Or did you do that test? Because it's not here. So that's really helpful. That's all I've got. Any questions?
I have one question.
Go for it.
So would you recommend a lab notebook with graph paper in it, or just like with straight lines for this particular project?
So typically at LSU, we would normally buy you lab notebooks, and we usually do get the graph paper, but I don't know that that's strictly necessary. I would not use a spiral notebook though. I would use one of those kind of sealed binding.
Yeah, like the marble covered ones?
Yes, yes.
Gotcha.